me now to discuss the U.S.-Hungary energy deal is Rod Martin, founder and CEO of Martin Capital, and Kervin Aucoin, a former intelligence professional with direct experience in U.S.-Russia relations. During the first Trump administration, he participated in an overt anti-Russia campaign and now hosts the geopolitical intelligence podcast, This Week Explained. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. Kervin, the U.S. says its waiver for Hungary will last 1 year, but Budapest says it's indefinite. Help us make sense of this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. Very important discussion and for the people of Hungary, I would say. So far, right now, if you trust the reporting and the analysis that I trust, is that this is for 1 year with a supplemental flow for the future. So as of right now, we're looking at a 1 year reprieve from sanctions. It's very important because Orban is going through an election season, right? So we've got April elections coming up in Hungary, and this is something that was very important to the Hungarian people and that Orban needed to get from the Trump administration. And really, it's going to save the Hungarian people a ton of money, but it's also going to protect them through this winter season as well.
And staying with that, Rod, how important is Russian oil and gas to the landlocked nation of Hungary?
Well, you just hit it on the head. They're a landlocked country in the middle. They really don't have any good options for the time being. We can't just go in and build an LNG terminal in a place that doesn't have ocean access. Now, could we build one in Croatia and pipe LNG up to Hungary? Yes, and there is an existing pipeline through there that is useful as a supplemental source of supply, but certainly not to cover all the needs of the country. So Hungary really needs this in the same way that Slovakia needs this, perhaps a bit more. And so this is the right thing to do to help keep them on side, help keep them in the right direction. And you'll notice the rest of the deal is that the president got them to commit to some pretty significant purchases from the United States, including a bunch of small modular reactors. That puts money and jobs in the United States. It also lessens Hungary's dependency.
Kervin, what signal does this deal send to neighboring Russia and Ukraine and the rest of Europe, for that matter?
Well, I think what the rest of Europe is saying is that this is a bad deal. But look, the rest of Europe has been doing this as well. They've been bypassing sanctions in a few ways, purchasing Russian oil. Other nations are doing this. Look, this is a diplomatic win for President Trump, and I think a lot of people, especially some within other media sources, do not like when Trump gets a victory here. The Hungarian people needed this. My partner on the other side there was astute in his analysis of this situation. But what does this mean for Ukraine specifically? I don't see that this means much for Ukraine. Ukraine is still getting support from the United States. Trump is still putting pressure on Russia. This is a moment to protect the Hungarian people. And what does this signal to Russia? It is that if you come to a deal with U.S. President Trump and it is a deal in good faith, you are going to get support. And so this might be a trigger to Russian President Vladimir Putin that come to the negotiating table, signals a signing of a deal for a ceasefire, and maybe you can get some sanctions relief.
And at the same time, Russia does indeed benefit from this. They have another buyer of oil that they might not have otherwise. So, Rod, Hungary is one of Europe's largest buyers of Russian oil. What relief do you think this waiver will give to the Russian economy? How significant is this?
Not that significant. If we are able to dislodge India and at least in part China, and I'd guess that China's a lot tougher nut to crack on that than India, the Russian economy is just getting trashed. And that's on two sides. First, you have very, very limited purchases of Russian energy now, and that's only going to shrink. Second, they're selling it at about $35 a barrel, which is about half global market price. And it's certainly a lot less than they need to run the Russian government. The government is highly dependent on these oil and gas sales, much more so than the Russian economy as a whole. So this is a drop in the bucket for Russia, but it's essential for Hungary. And especially, as I said, moving them more toward nuclear lessens their dependency on Russia or anybody else outside going forward. And that's going to matter too.
So we're talking about the economic impacts of this move on Russia, but what does it mean, Kervin, politically and militarily?
Yeah, I said
Well, politically and militarily.
Sorry, Kervin.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. Yeah. I'd start politically. Politically, like I said, this means that if you come to the negotiating table with President Trump in good faith, there are going to be deals that are going to be struck. Militarily, look, Russia's in a military economy. The purchasing of gas at 35%, $35 or 35 cents on the dollar, that's not going to do anything. The reason Vladimir Putin will not come to the negotiating table and will not accept a ceasefire is twofold. One, he wants all of Ukraine, and two, or at least every part of Ukraine that Russia has now controlled militarily. And the second part is because this is a wartime economy. In a wartime, as soon as the war ends, the economy will collapse. Russia will be forced to pay certain aspects of this to rebuilding Ukraine, whether they win or not. That is going to collapse the Russian government. This is a war of attrition. Putin thinks he can win a war of attrition, and that is what he's going to try to do.
Ron, how are these oil sanctions playing out, not just for Russia, like we discussed, but for the rest of the world?
Well, the European Union has spoken with forked tongue on this for years. They're finally getting their act together. And there are a few stragglers like Hungary, like Slovakia, that actually have to have their own special carve out. But in general, what is true is that the European Union has sent twice as much money to Moscow in energy purchases since the beginning of the war as they've sent to Kiev in aid, which is just absurd. That is finally ending. So that's actually a really big deal. The other thing that's a really big deal that must not be missed is that Ukraine is very self-consciously targeting Russian oil production. They had taken 17% of Russian refinery capacity offline as of the beginning of October. They're continuing those strikes. That could reach as much as 35% in reasonably rapid order. That actually puts the Russian economy in a situation where it can't supply domestic need. It certainly can't sell enough to keep the war machine going. So Russia really needs, they haven't decided to do it yet, but they ultimately need a deal with the United States that involves a lot of Western investment back into Russia. They're going to have to pay for that.
And so, we're talking about the impacts on Russia. Kervin, during this meeting with President Trump on Friday at the cabinet, Viktor Orban said that essentially it's almost inevitable for victory for Ukrainian victory, or at least for peace between these two parties, Ukraine and Russia. But it depends on whether or not the West can unify. And he stated that the rest of Europe has a sort of different approach to how to end this war. They think that he said they think that Ukraine should be able to push Russia back and win militarily. And he said basically it's possible, but so are miracles. So what do you make of his statements? Do you think that the West is so ununified on this?
Yeah, I think some parts of the West are a little ununified now. I think, look, we want an end to this war. We meaning the globe, right? I'm not talking about the global West or the global South. We all want an end to this war. And so who's going to agree to what? What does a Ukrainian victory look like? I think, early on in the discussions of this conflict, a Ukrainian defeat entirely was seen as possible. There were assessments that was likely, if not highly likely, that Ukraine would lose all of its sovereignty. We're not seeing that right now. Can Ukraine, to its people, send back a message that says, look, I know we lost eastern parts of our borders, but we won this war. We took on the big bear that is the Russian Federation and the Russian military. And Without the complete support of Western nations, we really did win this war. That's the miracle here. Does Ukraine have to push back Russia? I don't think so. I think we can come to a deal here. Unfortunately, having to give up eastern parts. That's funny for me to say as someone who's not in Ukraine and who's not a Ukrainian, but I do think that's just the reality on the ground right now.
Rod, final thoughts?
Look, a Ukrainian breakout is possible. Maybe they can take back some territory. Maybe they can take back all of it. But I agree that that's in the miracle category. But at the same time, Russia has lost this war. Russia was seeking regime change in Kiev, which they were going to bring about by quickly capturing the country. That fell apart on them in the first couple weeks. So ultimately, you've got to get to some kind of negotiated settlement. Putin's problem is that he promised his oligarchs things that he cannot deliver, and he is personally endangered if he makes peace and makes that a permanent, concrete fact. So he's going to fight as long as he thinks he can get away with it. But the truth is, Russia's position is weakening every single day, and it's not just on the battleground.
All right, Rod Martin and Kervin Aucoin, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.